This week, we're going to talk about how to write a funny story. So the elements of a story are very similar to how you have a beginning and a middle and an end. Sometimes a funny story starts in the middle and you go back to the beginning and then you go through the middle again and then you tell the end. Sometimes losing your place is part of what's funny about a story. But in every story, you need to give some sort of context. So you need to set up the scene, let people know where you're at, when you're at. So at what point of time are you in a holiday? Are you watching a movie? Is this something that happened to you this year or last year? And you tell this big story. So you have this one big story, but then somewhere in the middle of that story, you get distracted and then you tell a smaller story. Then you go back to the original story and then you tell your punchline. And then, assuming that you get a laugh, you tell a punchline again. So you either repeat the punchline or you come up with a completely different punchline. So those are the elements of a story. You've got a scene that you set up, you've got a story that you tell, you've got a smaller related story that you tell, and then you go back to the original story and finish it with a punchline. So let's break this down into smaller pieces. So the first thing is we're going to set up our context, or we're going to set up the scene. So you can do this by asking a question. You need to find something that's in common with the audience. So whether or not the audience has ever watched a documentary about parrots, they understand the concept of watching TV, they know what a documentary is. So you've established some sort of a common ground with the audience, which is important. You can also make an observation. I was watching this documentary and the parrots were really loud. It could also be a point in time. Maybe you saw a parrot when you were at the zoo. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to set up a scene, give the audience some sort of a context, because the thing about a funny story is it's funny to us because we were there, but you have to make sure that the audience feels like they are there too. So you literally have to describe the scene in a short enough amount of time, but in enough detail that they feel like they're there with you. Where we're at, why we're there, and what's happening, and who's with us. Who are the characters? When I'm watching that documentary about parrots, is there anybody in the room with me who's also watching that documentary? The nice thing about characters is that you can give them dialogue and they can be part of the joke. They could be part of the punchline. Then the big story, you have to figure out why this is funny to anyone except you and the people who were there. How can you get people to relate to your experience? This is going to be funny because people know about parrots, they associate them with pirates. So I'm going to be able to weave that together somehow to come up with a punchline about pirates there at the end. Examples of other types of things that people have in common. Life is messy. So your punchline could be something like that. It could be that people are weird, or my pet is so crazy. These are things that other people who have pets know that their pets have done funny things. And so you're going to tell them a story about a funny thing that your pet did. Then there's the smaller related story. So this is where you're going to say, let's say that, for example, you started the story in the middle. You're going to say, wait, but first, let me tell you about this other person. So if you forgot to set up the context, you could say, oh, wait, let me go back to the beginning. The small related story is where you pick up on some of those quick laughs. They could be random facts or puns, rhyming words, things that tie into the big story, but this is how people talk. They start telling a story, and then they start telling another story, and then they say, wait, where was I again? And just getting distracted is something that's kind of funny, because again, everybody does it. Here's your punchline. So you have several opportunities to make people laugh. So you can make them smile when you're just setting up the context. Then the story, you have to get them interested or invested in the outcome somehow. So it draws people into the story, and they might be confused, but they want to know what happens next. And then you move into that related story. But then you have to get yourself back to the original story, and you have to do it pretty quickly. Then you finish out your story, you hit them with your punchline, you get them with a second punchline because you want to keep them laughing, and then you would tell another story, another smaller story, You give that punchline, and then you want to come back. It's called a callback at the end, where you come back to this original punchline and you say it again at the end of your act. And then finally, the stories don't have to be totally true. They just have to be true enough that you'll remember to tell the story. Like, you'll remember enough details about the story, because you have to have this memorized. You're not going to be reading it. You can exaggerate. You could tell the story that you wish would have happened. If it would have had a funnier outcome, if just one thing would have changed about the story, then you can tell that story. You can't steal anybody else's punchline. So even though you could tell the same kind of story, you need to make sure that what's making people laugh isn't something that you've heard someplace else. You have to make sure that you make that up on your own. And that's it. Those are the elements of a story. If you put all those together, you should be able to come up with a pretty good joke. All right, let's practice. Number one, come up with a context. So why is this going to be funny to the audience? Is it because everybody knows a character like the one that you're going to present to them? Or is it because everyone has been through the same or a similar situation? Or is it funny because of some other reason? Remember that you need to find common ground with your audience. Then you need to set the scene. Where does the story take place? When does the story take place? And then who is in the story? So list those things out. Then you describe 2 main points or lessons you learned from the story. This can set you up for just the little chuckle, or it could turn into what your punchlines are. So now that you have enough of the story, start thinking about what those 2 punchlines are going to be for it. And then go on ahead and write the whole story out now. And that's all there is to it. Once you know the elements of a story, it's pretty easy for you to reuse this formula and write as many stories as you need, depending on how long of a set you're going to perform. A story can take anywhere between 30 seconds to 2 or 3 minutes if you really wanted it to. The better you get at telling stories, the longer your stories are going to be.